A 76-year-old woman stood up in a courtroom in a blue dress with a folded American flag on the table in front of her and said 5 words that silenced every person in the room. No one else would help me. And then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the last people anyone expected walked in. This is how it started. The rain came down hard that Tuesday evening on Route 9. Not the kind of rain that passes. Not the kind that taps on your windshield like a polite guest and moves along. This was the kind of rain that meant something. The kind that falls like the sky has made a decision about you and doesn't plan on changing its mind. Somewhere between Millbrook and nowhere between a gas station that had closed at 6 and a diner whose neon sign buzzed like a dying insect in the dark, a 1998 Buick LeSabre sat on the shoulder of the road with its hazard lights blinking. Inside that car, a woman sat alone. Her name was Lenora Hollis. She was 76 years old. Her hands were on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 the way her husband had taught her 40 years ago, even though the engine had been dead for 20 minutes and the wheel wasn't going anywhere. She held it because holding something was better than holding nothing. Because when everything else in your life has been pulled out from under you, sometimes the only thing left to do is grip what's in front of you and refuse to let go. On the passenger seat beside her was a manila folder. Inside that folder was a letter from First Regional Bank of Pennsylvania. And inside that letter were 3 words that had been sitting in her chest all day long, like stones she couldn't cough up. Vacate the premises. 3 words, 30 letters, and 52 years of a life reduced to a deadline. She had been turned away 3 times that day. The first was a mechanic on Pine Street who had already pulled his bay doors down and was locking up. She had asked him if he could look at her car. He had looked at the rain, looked at his watch, and said he opened at 8 in the morning. He didn't ask her what was wrong. He didn't ask if she needed a phone. He locked his door and walked to his truck and drove away without looking back. The second was a neighbor, not a close one, a man named Dwight who lived 2 roads over and who Lenore had spoken to exactly 4 times in 20 years. She had pulled into his driveway because his lights were on and because she had no other idea. Dwight came to the door in a bathrobe and slippers, and when Lenore explained that her car had stalled and she needed help getting home, he looked past her at the rain and said he didn't want to get involved in anything tonight. He said it like she was bringing him a problem wrapped in a lawsuit. He said goodnight and closed the door before she finished her sentence. The third was a sheriff's deputy. A patrol car that happened to pass while she was standing beside her open hood in the rain, trying to see something she wouldn't have understood even in daylight. The deputy slowed down. He rolled his window down 3 inches. He asked if she was all right. She told him her car had broken down and she didn't have anyone to call. He said he'd radio someone and they'd send a tow when they could. Then he drove away. Nobody came. That was 2 hours ago. The rain kept falling, the hazard lights kept blinking, and Lenora Hollis sat in a dead car on a dark road and did the only thing she had left to do. She waited. She waited the way women of her generation wait, without complaint, without drama, with a stillness that looks like patience from the outside, but is something else entirely from the inside. It is the stillness of a person who has spent an entire life being strong for other people and has run out of people to be strong for. And then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the rain, a sound that came up through the asphalt and through the floorboards of the car and into the base of her spine before it reached her ears. A deep rolling thunder that had nothing to do with the sky. Chrome headlights cut through the dark like the eyes of something ancient and unsentimental. Engines growled in a low chorus, 5 or 6 of them, moving in formation, the way only men who have ridden together for years know how to move. The headlights swept across the back of Lenora's car. The engines dropped to idle. Boots hit wet pavement. And the last person on earth she expected stepped off his bike and walked toward her window through the rain. His name, according to the patch on his leather vest, was Stone. But the town of Millbrook knew him by his given name, Silas Kincaid. And in Millbrook, when people said that name, they said it the way you say the name of a weather event. Not with hatred, not even with fear, exactly. With the kind of cautious respect you give to something you know is bigger than you and operates by rules you don't fully understand. Silas Kincaid was 51 years old. He stood 6'3" in his boots and weighed 240 pounds. Most of it in his shoulders and arms, which were the kind of arms that made you think of bridge cables and dock ropes and things that hold heavy objects in place during storms. His head was shaved on the sides, the remaining dark gray hair slicked back in a style that somehow looked both modern and ancient at the same time. His beard was long and thick and white-gray, reaching down to his chest like something out of a Norse legend that had wandered into rural Pennsylvania by mistake. He had a small gauge piercing in one ear. His forearms and arms were covered in dense dark ink, tribal patterns and Celtic knots that wrapped around his skin like armor made of stories he never told anyone. He wore a sleeveless black leather vest with multiple patches and a red emblem badge on the chest. No shirt underneath, revealing every inch of those tattooed arms. Dark blue jeans, large hands that looked like they could crush a beer can or cradle a bird with equal ease. And his face. That was the thing about Silas Kincaid that people in Millbrook could never quite reconcile. Because underneath all of it, underneath the show and the ink and the leather and the reputation, his expression was warm. Not soft. Warm. The way a wood stove is warm. The way a man who has seen terrible things and chosen gentleness anyway is warm. It was the kind of face that made you feel two things at the same time and you were never sure which one to trust. He was a Gulf War veteran, enlisted at 18, served with the 1st Infantry Division in Desert Storm, came home, tried to be a civilian, failed at it the way most combat veterans fail at it, not because they're broken, but because the world they came back to didn't have a shape that fit them anymore. He re-enlisted in 2003, served in Fallujah, came home again to a country that had moved on without him, and a brother named Liam, who was the only person left in his life who looked at him and saw the boy he used to be instead of the man he had become. Liam died 3 years later, a motorcycle accident on a wet road, a senseless, stupid accident, the kind that doesn't mean anything and takes everything. Silas had rebuilt the engine on Liam's Harley-Davidson FLH the summer before the two of them in the garage with the radio on and the sun coming through the bay door, and Liam had looked up from the carburetor with grease on his forehead and said something that Silas would never repeat to anyone because it belonged to that afternoon, and that afternoon was gone. After Liam, Silas found the club. Or the club found him. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that for the first time since the Army, he was surrounded by men who didn't flinch at who he was, men who showed up, men who stayed, men who understood that brotherhood wasn't a word you said. It was a thing you did over and over until it became the only structure your life had left. He had a code. He kept it. And part of that code was something he had never said out loud, but had always lived by. You don't leave the vulnerable to be eaten by the powerful. His mother had taught him that. She had been a woman who stood alone against the world for most of her life, and she had done it without breaking. She had raised 3 boys on a waitress salary in a town that didn't care if they ate or not, and she had done it with a kind of fierce, quiet dignity that Silas had spent his entire adult life trying to live up to. When he saw those hazard lights blinking in the rain on Route 9, he didn't think about it. He didn't weigh the options. He didn't check the time or consider whether it was convenient. He pulled over. He got off his bike, and he walked through the rain. 2 knocks on the window. Not aggressive, not tentative, just 2 knocks. The kind of knock that says, I'm here and that's not going to change. Lenora looked up through the rain-streaked glass and saw a face that under normal circumstances would have sent her reaching for the door lock. A giant of a man in a leather vest with a beard like a biblical patriarch and arms like something carved out of oak and covered in dark ink from wrist to shoulder. She felt the kind of fear that sits at the back of your throat, the kind that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives and waits. But she was also out of options. She had been out of options for 2 hours. She had been out of options if she was honest with herself for much longer than that. She rolled down the window. Rain came in. She looked at him, and she said the only thing she had left to say. No one else would help me. 4 words, and they landed on Silas Kincaid like a weight he recognized. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He didn't offer her a speech about how everything was going to be all right. He just looked at her with those warm, steady eyes and nodded once. Pop the hood for me. He found the problem in under 4 minutes. A busted coolant hose. He went back to his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of thermal tape and a spare clamp because that was the kind of man he was. Always prepared, always caring what others might need even when he didn't know who those others would be. He fixed it right there in the rain. His hands moved with the kind of quiet competence that comes from decades of fixing things that were broken, engines, machines. The kinds of problems that have solutions unlike the other kinds, the kinds that keep you awake at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for thanks. He just wiped his hands on a rag, looked at Lenora through the rain and said 5 words. "Follow me into town. You'll be safe." She followed him. Think about that for a second. Think about Lenora sitting in that car, 76 years old, alone in the rain, holding an eviction notice, watching stranger after stranger drive past her blinking hazard lights. How many people saw those lights that night and kept going? How many people looked at that situation and decided it wasn't their problem? And now think about what it says that the one person who stopped, the one person who got off his bike in the pouring rain and got his hands dirty under that hood, was the one person everyone in town had already decided to be afraid of. That's not a detail. That is the whole story. They pulled into Millbrook around 8 in the evening. Silas walked Lenora inside the Blue Ridge Diner, a narrow place with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee machine that hadn't been silent in 30 years, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't played anything since Clinton was in office. The moment the door opened and people saw the patch on Silas's back, the room changed. It changed the way a room changes when the barometric pressure drops. Conversations didn't stop exactly. They thinned. Forks paused midair. A couple in the corner booth looked at each other, grabbed their coats, and left without finishing their pie. The waitress behind the counter, a young woman named Jolene with dark circles under her eyes and a pencil behind her ear, kept her head down and refilled the coffee pot 3 times without anyone asking. This was Millbrook. And in Millbrook, when Stone Kincaid walked in, you either got small or got gone. But here is what nobody in that diner expected. Silas didn't sit at the counter with his brothers. He didn't take the booth by the door the way he usually did back to the walleyes on the room. He pulled out the seat across from Lenora in a booth by the window, and he sat down. He ordered 2 coffees, black, and he did something that most of the people in that diner had never seen him do. He listened. Not the way people listen when they're waiting for their turn to talk. Not the way people listen when they're being polite. He listened the way men listen when they have learned through hard experience that the world gives you more when you stop trying to fill it with your own noise. He listened with his whole body. Still, present, focused on her face the way a man focuses on a map when he knows he's in unfamiliar territory and the wrong turn could cost him everything. Lenora told him about Walter. She told him the way she told everything. Measured, precise, without self-pity. The facts arranged in order, the emotions kept behind a door that she opened only when she was alone. Walter Hollis, her husband, a man who had come home from Korea in 1953 with a Purple Heart, a Silver Star, and a left knee that would never bend properly again, and who had never once complained about any of it. He had built their house on Birch Creek Road himself with nothing but his own hands and the kind of patience that only a man who has survived a war understands over the course of 2 summers in the early 70s. Every room in that house still smelled like sawdust and the particular warmth of a man who believed that building something with your own hands was the closest a person could get to prayer. Walter had died 4 years ago. Lung cancer, the kind that moves through a body the way a fire moves through dry timber, fast and thorough and indifferent to everything the body had ever been or done or loved. The medical bills that followed had been systematic in their cruelty. They arrived month after month, each one chipping away at something Walter had spent decades building the way water chips away at stone. Not all at once, just enough to make you wonder if you were imagining it, just enough to make you think you might be going crazy. And then Harmon Leland had started calling. When Lenora said that name, something happened in Silas's face. Not a dramatic reaction, not a scene, just a muscle in his jaw that tightened and stayed tight. A stillness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The kind of stillness that isn't empty. The kind that's full of something the person hasn't decided to say yet. Lenora noticed. She stopped talking for a moment. "Do you know him?" she asked. Silas looked at his coffee. "I know the name," he said, and left it at that. But that name was doing something to him. Something he wasn't ready to say out loud. Because Harmon Leland wasn't just a developer. He was a man with connections to the county permit office, the local zoning board, and a history of making problems disappear in ways that required money and silence in equal measure. He had the kind of reputation that existed in 2 versions. There was the public version, the philanthropist, the sponsor, the man whose name appeared on the new wing of the county library, in the youth baseball field, in the annual Veterans Day breakfast at the Elks Lodge. And then there was the other version, the one that people in Millbrook spoke about only in kitchens and parking lots in low voices after checking who was within earshot. The version that involved shell companies and county officials and land deals that always seemed to work out in Harmon Leland's favor in ways that were technically legal but felt like something else entirely. He was also a man who had over the past 3 years positioned himself as the quiet sponsor of the Millbrook chapter's annual bike rally. $50,000, the biggest donation the rally had ever received, enough to cover venue's insurance security and enough left over to fund their veterans outreach program for the entire year. $50,000, that's not a donation, that's a leash, which meant the club had history with Leland, which meant touching Leland meant touching the club. And Silas knew that better than anyone because just that morning before he had ever heard of Lenora Hollis or seen her hazard lights or fixed her coolant hose in the rain, his chapter president, Rex Brennan, had pulled him aside in the parking lot behind the garage and said something that had been sitting in Silas's mind all day like a splinter he couldn't reach. "We don't get involved in civilian messes, Stone. Whatever you're thinking, don't." Silas hadn't told anyone anything. He hadn't mentioned Lenora because he hadn't met her yet. He hadn't made any moves, hadn't asked any questions, hadn't so much as looked in the direction of Harmon Leland. So how did Rex know something was coming? Lenora continued talking. She talked the way she did everything else, with structure, with precision, and without asking for anything she hadn't earned. She told Silas what she had done, not what had been done to her, what she had done. This was the thing about Lenora Hollis that most people missed because they saw the white hair and the 76 years and the reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and they saw a woman who needed saving. But Lenora Hollis had been saving herself for 3 years before Silas Kincaid ever pulled into that parking lot. She had refused every one of Leland's purchase offers, 7 of them, each one slightly higher than the last, each one delivered by a different attorney in a different suit, each one carrying the same unspoken message underneath the numbers. This is going to happen whether you agree to it or not. The only question is whether you get paid. She had called 3 legal aid organizations. 2 had wait lists measured in months. The third told her that her case didn't qualify for pro bono representation because her income, Walter's military pension, was technically above the threshold by $11 a month. She had written letters to her state representative, her congressman, and the office of the county commissioner. She received one response, a form letter thanking her for her civic engagement and directing her to a website for senior housing assistance. She was not a woman who had failed to act. She was a woman who had acted and been met with silence from every direction. Every door she had knocked on had been opened just enough for someone to look at her and then closed again. And then came Grady Potts. Lenora told Silas about Grady the way a field commander delivers a report. Dates, rhymes, details. Grady Potts was a man in his early 40s with a shaved head and a neck like a fire hydrant, and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He had shown up at Lenora's property 3 times in the past 6 months. The first time he had parked his truck at the end of her driveway and sat there for 45 minutes without getting out. Just sat there, watching the house. When Lenora came out onto the porch and asked him what he wanted, he said he was checking his GPS and drove away. The second time he came while she was at the grocery store. When she got home, the water supply line to her house had been shut off at the main valve. Not broken. Shut off. The kind of thing that could be explained away as a municipal issue if anyone bothered to investigate, which no one would because when Lenora called the water company, they said they had no record of any service interruption. The third time a no trespassing sign appeared on her property. Not her sign. She had never posted one. It was a new sign professionally printed with the name of a property management company she had never heard of listed at the bottom. She pulled it out of the ground herself and put it in her garage. She called Sheriff Dale Holt after the water incident. Holt was a man in his early 50s with a neat mustache and a careful handshake and the kind of eyes that were always calculating something behind the friendly expression. He came to the house. He walked around the property. He looked at the water valve. He looked at the ground. He stood in the driveway with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he said 5 words that Lenora would never forget. "I don't see any evidence." Then he got in his car and drove away. And that was the moment Lenora understood something she had spent 3 years trying not to understand. The system wasn't broken. The system was working exactly the way it was designed to work. It just wasn't designed to work for her. Silas sat across from her in that booth and watched her tell this story. He watched the way her hands stayed steady around the coffee cup. He watched the way her eyes didn't water. He watched the way she laid out the facts like a woman who had already cried about this in private and was done crying about it and had moved on to the part where you decide what to do next. And something shifted in him, not a decision exactly, something before a decision, the ground underneath a decision. The moment when you look at a situation and you stop seeing a problem and start seeing a person and that person reminds you of someone you loved, and that recognition changes the shape of everything that comes after. Lenore reminded him of his mother, not in any specific way, not the face or the voice or any of the usual things. It was the backbone, the refusal to collapse, the way she sat in that booth like she was daring the world to hit her again, not because she wanted to be hit, but because she had decided a long time ago that she would rather take it standing than dodge it on her knees. It was late when they left the diner. Silas walked Lenora to her car. The rain had softened to a mist. The parking lot lights threw long orange shadows across the wet asphalt. Lenora stopped at her driver's side door and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, "for the car and for listening." He nodded. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He waited. "Why did you stop tonight? Why you and not anyone else?" Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Lenora would carry with her for a long time. Because someone should have. She got in her car. She drove home to the house on Birch Creek Road, the house Walter built with his own hands. She unlocked the front door. She walked through the hallway where the photographs of Walter lined the walls. Walter in his uniform. Walter at their wedding, young and thin and grinning in black and white. Walter at the kitchen table, older, grayer, still grinning. Walter everywhere. Walter in every room. Walter in the wood, in the nails in the door frames, in the particular way the third stair from the bottom creaked, because he had always said he would fix it and never did, because she secretly loved the sound, and he secretly knew that. She walked into the living room. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a folded American flag in a triangle case. Beside it, a small framed citation. She looked at it the way she looked at it every night. She looked at it the way a woman looks at proof that the man she loved was exactly who she believed him to be. She didn't cry. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened the drawer and pulled out a spiral notebook, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $2. She opened it to the first page, and she began to write. Dates, names, phone numbers, the day Harmon Leland first called, the day the second offer arrived, the name on the property management sign, the license plate number on Grady Potts's truck, which she had memorized because Lenora Hollis was the kind of woman who paid attention to details even when the details frightened her, especially when the details frightened her. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she was done, she had 6 pages of notes in a handwriting that was small and tight and precise, the handwriting of a woman who had spent her entire life being careful with words because she understood that words were the only weapons she had ever been allowed to carry. She closed the notebook. She set the pen down. She looked across the kitchen at the flag on the mantel barely visible in the dim light from the hallway. "I'm not leaving this house, Walter," she said quietly. "Not the way they want me to." She stood up. She turned off the light. She locked the front door, the back door, and the window in the spare bedroom that had never locked properly and that Walter had always said he would get to. And somewhere on a dark road between Millbrook and everywhere else, Silas Kincaid rode home slower than usual. The questions following him were the kind that don't let you sleep. Why did Leland want that land badly enough to push a 76-year-old widow into foreclosure? What was underneath all those zoning filings and shell company names? And why had Rex known something was coming before Silas even knew it himself? Rain had stopped by the time he pulled into his driveway. The air smelled like wet asphalt and pine, and something else, something he couldn't name yet but would. Something that smelled like the beginning of a debt he didn't know he owed being called in at last. He cut the engine. He sat on the bike in the silence. And he thought about a woman in a dead car on a dark road holding an eviction notice, who had looked up at him through rain-streaked glass and said 4 words that were still echoing in his chest like a bell that someone had rung and no one could unring. No one else would help me. He had stopped tonight because it was the right thing to do, but something was telling him that stopping was just the beginning. That this road went further than a busted coolant hose and a cup of coffee at the Blue Ridge Diner. That the woman in the blue sedan, with the steady hands and the careful voice and the notebook full of names, was about to pull him into something that would cost more than a strip of thermal tape in a Tuesday evening. He didn't know how much yet, but he was starting to. 3 days after Route 9, Lenora Hollis did something that surprised no one who truly knew her and everyone who didn't. She got in her car at 7 in the morning, drove 14 miles to the Allegheny County Records Office in downtown Millbrook, walked through the front doors before the clerk had finished his first cup of coffee, and asked to see every publicly available zoning filing from the past 5 years connected to the name Harmon Leland or any of his known business entities. The clerk, a young man with thin shoulders and a tie that was slightly too short, looked at her over the rim of his glasses the way people in their 20s look at people in their 70s when the older person asks for something that requires effort. He asked her if she had a specific filing number. She did not. He asked her if she had a case reference. She did not. He asked her if she had an attorney who could submit a formal records request. She told him she did not have an attorney, she did not have a case reference, she did not have a filing number, but she did have a constitutional right to access public records in the state of Pennsylvania, and she had all day. He brought her the files. Lenora sat at a long wooden table in the back of the records room for 4 hours. She did not understand most of what she was reading. She did not understand the language of zoning amendments and environmental impact studies and easement agreements and the particular kind of legal prose that exists specifically to make simple things incomprehensible to the people those simple things affect most. But she understood names, and she understood patterns, and she had brought the spiral notebook. She wrote down every name that appeared on any document connected to Harmon Leland. She wrote down company names. She wrote down dates. She wrote down the addresses of properties mentioned in the filings. And when she found documents that seemed important, but she couldn't understand, she took photographs with a disposable camera she had bought at the drugstore on her way in because Lenora Hollis did not own a smartphone and had never needed one and was not about to start needing one now. By 11 o'clock, she had 12 pages of notes and 26 photographs. She did not know what she had found. But she knew she had found something because the clerk who had ignored her for the first 2 hours had spent the last hour watching her from behind his desk with an expression that looked less like boredom and more like concern. She drove to Silas Kincaid's garage that afternoon. He was underneath a Sportster when she pulled in. She could see his boots and the lower half of his legs sticking out from under the frame. She didn't call out. She just stood there in the doorway with her notebook and her disposable camera and waited. When he rolled out and saw her standing there, small and silver-haired and determined, holding a spiral notebook, like it was a weapon, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't wait for me." "I've been waiting for 3 years," Lenora said. "I'm done waiting." She spread her notes out on his workbench. She showed him the names. She showed him the dates. She showed him the patterns she had noticed even without understanding the legal language. The same 3 shell companies appearing on every filing, the same county officials signing off on every approval, the same sequence of events repeating across multiple properties. Silas looked at the notes for a long time. Then he looked at Lenora. And for the first time since they had met, he smiled. Not a big smile. Not the kind of smile that comes with a sound. Just the corner of his mouth and something in his eyes that looked like respect. "You did all this today?" he asked. "This morning," she said, "before lunch." That Thursday night, Silas walked into church. Not the kind with pews and hymnals, the kind with cigarette smoke and motor oil. Thursday night church was what the Millbrook chapter called their weekly meeting. It was held in the back room of Rex Brennan's garage, a cinder block building on the east side of town with a corrugated steel roof and a single bare bulb hanging over a table that had seen more history than most courtrooms. 12 men sat around that table. The air was thick with smoke and the particular silence that fills a room when every man in it knows that the man who just walked in is about to say something that's going to make the evening more complicated. Rex Brennan sat at the head of the table the way he always sat, still, controlled, with the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its voice because it has never had to. Rex was 63 years old, a bear of a man with iron gray hair and a scar along the right side of his jaw that he had never explained to anyone and no one had ever asked about, because in this room you didn't ask about scars. You earned the right to hear about them, or you didn't. He had led this chapter for 19 years, through territory disputes, through federal surveillance, through member losses and internal disputes that would have shattered lesser men and lesser organizations. Rex Brennan was not cruel. He was not corrupt. He was not the enemy. That was what made this hard. Rex laid it out clean. No preamble, no politics. Harmon Leland had just committed to a $50,000 sponsorship of the annual rally, the biggest single donation in chapter history. It covered venue, rental, insurance, security detail, and enough left over to fund the Veterans Outreach Program for the entire calendar year. The outreach program that provided emergency housing assistance to homeless veterans in 3 counties. The program that had helped 41 men in the past 18 months alone. "We stay out of his business," Rex said. His voice was level, not cold. Level, the voice of a man who has weighed 2 bad options and chosen the one that keeps more people alive. That's the arrangement. He doesn't ask us for anything. We don't ask him for anything. Clean. He looked around the table. He looked at every face. He looked at Silas last. "We clear," 11 men nodded. Silas said, "There's an old woman losing her home because of him." The room didn't go silent because it was already silent. It went something past silent. It went into the kind of stillness where you can hear the electricity humming in the light bulb above the table. Rex looked at him, not surprised, not angry, just the steady assessing look of a man who has known you for 17 years and can see exactly where you're headed and wishes you were headed somewhere else. "Not our fight," Rex said. "She's not one of ours." "Her husband was a veteran," Silas said. "Korean War, Silver Star." Rex held his gaze for a long time. The scar along his jaw caught the light. "I hear you, brother. I do. But you wear that patch. You don't freelance. You push this, you push all of us, and I won't have that." Silas didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up from the table or make a gesture or do any of the things that men in movies do when they disagree with authority. He just sat there. He let the words sit in the room the way a stone sits at the bottom of a river. Present, unmoved, changing the current around it without trying. He drove to Lenora's house that night. Birch Creek Road was a quiet street at the edge of Millbrook Road where the town started giving way to farmland, and the sky opened up in a way that made you realize how small everything else was. Lenora's house was a white clapboard place with a porch swing that listed slightly to the left, and a garden that had been lovelier before the knees gave out and the money ran thin, and the only pair of hands that had ever tended it properly were in the ground at Millbrook Veterans Memorial Cemetery. Inside the house was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the heating. It was the kind of warmth that accumulates over decades, the residue of meals cooked, and conversations held, and evenings spent in the same room doing nothing in particular, which is the most important kind of doing there is. The walls themselves seemed to hold memory, the way old wood holds heat slowly, deeply, and long after the source is gone. The photographs were everywhere. Silas had seen houses with pictures on walls before, but this was different. This wasn't decoration. This wasn't a woman who had arranged frames to fill space. This was a woman who had turned her home into a record of a single man's life, because every photograph was a small act of defiance against the fact that he was gone. Walter young, Walter old, Walter in between. Every version of him preserved, every chapter accounted for, as if Lenora had decided that death could take the man, but it could not take the evidence that he had been here and that he had mattered. On the mantel above the fireplace, the folded American flag in its triangle case. Beside it, a small framed citation. Silas stood in front of the mantel and looked at the citation. He read it once, set it back down, read it again. The citation was dated November 1950, the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. It described an action in which a sergeant of the 7th Infantry Regiment, Walter Allen Hollis, had carried 2 wounded soldiers from a different unit out of a burning position under heavy enemy fire at significant personal risk, refusing to leave them despite direct orders to fall back. Both soldiers survived. Walter Hollis was awarded the Silver Star. One of the soldiers listed in the citation had a name Silas had not seen written down in his entire life, but had heard spoken 100 times, 1,000 times, at kitchen tables, at family dinners, at the cemetery on Memorial Day when his father would stand in front of a headstone and say nothing for a very long time and then say everything. Nathan Kincaid, not Silas's brother, his uncle, his father's older brother, the one who had gone to Korea at 20 and come home in a box, except that according to this citation, Nathan Kincaid had not died in that position. He had been pulled out alive by Walter Hollis. He had survived that night. He had lived for several more months, long enough to write letters home, long enough for Silas's father to receive those letters and keep them in a cigar box in the closet for the rest of his life. Nathan had died later. A different engagement, a different position, a different kind of bad luck. But Walter Hollis had given the Kincaid family something that no amount of money or time could buy. He had given them months, months of letters, months of knowing that Nathan was alive. Months that Silas's father had carried in his chest like a second heartbeat for the rest of his life. His father had spent decades trying to find the man who had saved his brother. He never did. He died in 2011 without ever knowing the name of the sergeant who had pulled Nathan from the fire. And now Silas was standing in that man's living room, looking at the citation, reading his uncle's name in a dead man's house while that dead man's widow made tea in the next room. He stood there for 2 full minutes without moving. Lenora came in from the kitchen with a cup of tea and found him holding the frame. She saw his face. She had seen many things in 76 years, and she knew what a man looked like when he had just been struck by something he didn't know was coming. "Are you all right?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas Kincaid didn't have anything to say. He sat down. He told her the name. He told her who Nathan was. He told her about his father. He told her about the cigar box full of letters that his father had kept in the closet and taken out every November and read in the kitchen by himself with the door closed. Lenora set down the tea. She sat across from him. Her face went through something complicated and quiet and deep, the way a lake goes through something when a stone is dropped into it. The surface changes, but the depth of it, the real weight of it, is underneath where you can't see. "Walter talked about that night every year until the day he died," she said. "He said those were the 2 men he was most grateful to have saved. He always wondered if they made it home." She looked at Silas. Her eyes were steady. "Did your uncle make it home?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "For a few more months," he said. "He was killed in another engagement that winter. But he wrote letters home during those months. My father kept every one. He read them every year on the anniversary." He paused. "My father spent his whole life trying to find the man who saved Nathan. He never did. He died not knowing." They sat in that living room for a long time without talking. The clock on the wall ticked. The flag on the mantel caught the lamplight. And the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. It was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people discover that they have been connected by something older and deeper than either of them knew, and the discovery changes the shape of everything. Lenora spoke first. "So you didn't just stop on that road by accident." "I stopped because it was raining and your lights were on. And you're still here because of Nathan." Silas looked at her. "I'm still here because of you. Nathan is the reason I'm not leaving." After that night, they worked together. But the balance was clear from the beginning, and Silas was careful to keep it that way. This was Lenora's fight. He was her support, not her savior, not her protector, her support. The difference mattered, and both of them knew it. Lenora had something Silas didn't. She had memory. 52 years of living in a town gives a person a kind of database that no filing system can match. She remembered the exact date Harmon Leland's first call had come. October 14th, 2021, a Thursday. She remembered because she had been canning tomatoes when the phone rang, and the tomatoes had boiled over while she listened to a man in a suit explain to her why selling her house was in her best interest. She remembered the name of every attorney who had delivered an offer. She remembered the license plate on Grady Potts's truck. Pennsylvania plate. 3 letters, 4 numbers. She had written it down the first time he parked in her driveway, because Lenora Hollis was the kind of woman who wrote things down. She laid out a timeline on the kitchen table. Dates down the left side, names down the right. Lines drawn between them in red pen. It looked like something a detective would build on a wall, and in a way that's exactly what it was. Silas took her notes and her photographs and cross-referenced them with publicly available county records. And within a week they found it, buried inside a 340-page environmental impact amendment in the county archives filed under a project number that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't looking for it, was the answer to the question that had been haunting Silas since the night on Route 9. Lenora's property on Birch Creek Road sat directly inside the projected path of a federally funded highway expansion that had not yet been made public. The route had been quietly confirmed at the state level 8 months earlier. Any developer who knew about it and acquired the land before the public announcement stood to collect 4 to 5 times the purchase price in government compensation through eminent domain proceedings. Harmon Leland knew. He had known for almost a year, and he had spent that year using every legal and financial lever available to him to pressure Lenora into selling at a fraction of what the land would be worth once the highway announcement went public, or to force her into foreclosure so he could acquire the property at auction for even less. This wasn't greed in the small, ordinary sense. This wasn't a man trying to make a quick dollar on a piece of land. This was calculated. This was systematic. This was a man who had looked at a 76-year-old widow living alone in a house her husband built and had seen not a person but a number on a spreadsheet, an obstacle between himself and a profit margin. And the more they dug, the worse it got, because Lenora's property wasn't the only one. The same pattern appeared on 6 other parcels along the projected highway route. Different shell companies, different attorneys, same structure, same strategy. Same man at the center of it, invisible behind layers of paperwork designed to make him impossible to find. And then Silas found the thing that made his stomach go cold. Several of the shell company permit filings he had been tracing weren't just connected to Harmon Leland, and they were connected to a series of zoning approvals that the Millbrook chapter had inadvertently facilitated years earlier. Not through crime, not through conspiracy, through relationships. A club member had a cousin in the county permit office. Favors had been exchanged over beers and barbecues. Paperwork had been moved through channels a little faster than it should have been. Nothing that would hold up as criminal. Nothing that anyone at the time would have looked at twice. But it was enough. If this went to court and the filings got subpoenaed, the club's name would be in the record. Rex's name would be on documents that connected, however indirectly, to a land fraud operation spanning multiple counties. And then the last piece fell into place. The reason Rex had warned him that morning in the parking lot before Silas had even met Lenora. Rex already knew about the filings. He had seen the club's name in Leland's paperwork months ago, had recognized what it would look like if anyone ever pulled the thread, and had made the calculation that silence was safer than exposure. He hadn't warned Silas out of malice. He had warned him out of fear. Rex Brennan, the man who had led this chapter through 19 years of everything the world could throw at it, was afraid, not of Leland, of what would happen to his men if the connection became public. And that fear, more than anything else Silas had discovered in those filing cabinets and county records, told him exactly how dangerous Harmon Leland was. That was the thing Leland was counting on. That was the insurance policy. The reason he was confident the club would stay quiet. Not because he was paying them off, because he had accidentally made them complicit without their knowledge, and now their silence was built into the architecture of his scheme like a load-bearing wall. Touch Leland and the wall comes down on everyone. Silas sat with this for one evening, just one. He sat in his garage at the workbench where Lenora's notes were still spread out, and he looked at the space on the floor where his brother's Harley-Davidson FLH used to sit. The bike he and Liam had rebuilt the summer before the accident. The bike he had ridden at the memorial. The last physical thing his brother had touched. He looked at it the way you look at something when you're about to make a decision that you can't take back. The next morning, he called a civil attorney in Allegheny County named Corinne Voss. She specialized in predatory foreclosures and municipal land abuse. She had a reputation for being precise and relentless and completely unimpressed by men who thought their money made them untouchable. Her retainer was $12,000. Silas sold the Harley on a Tuesday morning. A collector from Pittsburgh drove up in a trailer and paid in cash and drove away with the bike strapped down under a canvas cover. Silas stood in the driveway and watched the trailer disappear down the road, and he did not let himself think about it for long enough to change his mind. If you have ever had to give up something that was the last piece of someone you loved, you know what that costs. It isn't money. It doesn't matter how much money it is. It's the feeling that you are letting go of a hand you were still holding. It's the sound of the garage door closing on a space that will never be filled again. Lenora found out 3 days later. She came to the garage and saw the empty space on the floor, and she looked at Silas and she knew. "You sold it," she said, not a question. "I did. For me, for the attorney." She shook her head. "I didn't ask you to do that. I would never have asked you to do that." Silas looked at her. "You didn't ask, but your husband did something for my uncle 70 years ago that nobody asked him to do either. He carried a man out of a fire because that man needed carrying, and the debt on that has been sitting in my family for 3 generations." Lenora was quiet for a long time. "That's not a debt," she said. "That's just what Walter did." "Then this is just what I do," Silas said. "There was another betrayal coming, a quieter one, the kind that hurts more because it comes from someone who owes you something and chooses not to pay. Frank Embry lived 4 houses down from Lenora on Birch Creek Road. He was 70 years old and a retired electrician with a bad hip and a good memory, and a wife named Dorothy who had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 6 years ago. Lenora had spent 2 years of her life helping care for Dorothy. She had driven Dorothy to appointments when Frank couldn't. She had sat with Dorothy on afternoons when Dorothy didn't know where she was or who was sitting across from her. She had brought meals to their house 3 times a week during the worst of it, and she had done it without being asked and without expecting anything in return, because that was who Lenora Hollis was. Dorothy had passed 2 years ago. Frank had stood at the funeral and wept, and Lenora had stood beside him and held his arm, and he had looked at her and said, "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Lenora needed Frank now. She needed him to confirm on record that he had witnessed Grady Potts on her property. Frank's kitchen window looked directly at Lenora's driveway. He had seen Grady's truck. He had told Lenora so himself the day after the water incident, standing at her mailbox, shaking his head and saying, "I saw that son of a gun pull in yesterday. What's he up to?" She drove to Frank's house on a Wednesday afternoon. She knocked on his door. He answered in a flannel shirt and house slippers, and an expression that told her he already knew why she was there. She asked him directly. She asked him if he would be willing to provide a written statement confirming that he had seen Grady Potts on her property on the dates in question. Frank looked at her. He looked at the floor. He looked at the wall behind her at a spot that didn't have anything on it worth looking at. "Lenora," he said, "I can't get involved in this." "Frank, I know what you're going to say, and I'm sorry, but Leland has people. He has connections. If I put my name on something like that, I don't know what happens next." He paused. "I'm alone now, Lenora. I don't have anyone to back me up if things go sideways." Lenora looked at him for a long time. She didn't argue. She didn't remind him of the 2 years she had spent caring for his wife. She didn't remind him of the meals or the drives or the afternoons. She didn't say any of the things she had a right to say, because Lenora Hollis was not the kind of woman who used kindness as a currency to be collected later. She just nodded, and she turned and walked back to her car. That was a wound that went deeper than the eviction notice, deeper than Grady Potts and his truck and his dead eyes, deeper than Sheriff Holt and his 5 empty words. Because the eviction notice was an attack from a stranger. Frank's refusal was an abandonment by a friend, and Lenora had learned something that night on Route 9 that she was learning again now in a different way. Sometimes the people who should help you won't, and sometimes the people who shouldn't be anywhere near your life are the only ones who show up. The sheriff delivered a legal warning to Silas's residence 10 days before the court hearing. A notice that he was potentially subject to a civil harassment injunction if he continued making inquiries about Harmon Leland's business operations. The language was polite and precise and carried underneath its legal formalities the unmistakable message that someone with money and lawyers wanted Silas to sit down and be quiet. The same week, Leland's attorney sent a letter to the Millbrook chapter. It was addressed to Rex Brennan. It referenced their historical business relationship in language that was technically neutral but functionally threatening. It requested that the chapter manage its members in accordance with the spirit of their ongoing partnership. Rex called a vote. It was held on a Thursday night, the same back room, the same table, the same bare bulb. 12 men. Silas stood at one end of the table and did not plead his case. He had already said everything he was going to say. He had said it once clearly without raising his voice, and he was not going to say it again, because repeating yourself in a room full of men who have already heard you is not persuasion. It is begging. And Silas Kincaid did not beg. The vote was close, 7-5. But close doesn't matter when the result is what it is, temporary suspension. Rex delivered the verdict the way he delivered everything. Straight, clean, without cruelty, but without apology. You're suspended effective now. You can petition for reinstatement in 90 days. Turn in your patch. Silas reached for the patch on his vest. He had worn it for 17 years. He had earned it through a process that most people in the civilian world would never understand and would probably never want to. It represented the only family he had left in a world where every other family he had been part of his blood family, his military unit, the structures that men build to keep themselves from drowning, had either ended or fallen apart. He removed it carefully, not with anger, not with ceremony, with the particular care of a man who respects a thing enough to handle it properly even as it's being taken from him. He handed it to Rex. Their eyes met for a moment. Rex took it. Neither of them said a word. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. Silas drove home that night without his patch for the first time in 17 years. The vest felt lighter than it should have. Not in a good way. Lighter the way a house feels lighter after someone moves out. Lighter the way your chest feels after something you were holding on to finally lets go. Not relief, absence. The specific weight of something that used to be there and isn't anymore in the space it left behind is somehow heavier than the thing itself. He pulled into his driveway, cut the engine, sat in the dark. The garage door was still up, and he could see the empty space on the concrete floor where Liam's Harley had been. He had sold the bike and lost the patch in the same month. The two things that connected him to the two families he had chosen. Both gone now. He sat there for a long time. And somewhere on Birch Creek Road in a white clapboard house at the edge of town, Lenora Hollis sat on her porch in the cool evening air and looked out at the garden that had gone to seed and the road that led to a town that had turned its back on her, one person at a time. She was holding the spiral notebook in her lap, the one with 6 pages of names and dates and license plate numbers. The one she had started the night Silas fixed her car. It had grown since then, 12 pages now, cross-referenced, color-coded with 3 different pens, a timeline of a conspiracy that she had built with her own hands on a kitchen table in a house that someone was trying to take from her. She looked at the flag through the window. She could see it from the porch if she turned her head slightly to the left there on the mantel, catching the last of the evening light. She said something then, out loud, to Walter or to herself or to the evening air. It didn't matter which, because the words were the same regardless of who was listening. I'm not leaving this house any other way than the way I came into it, standing straight. She closed the notebook. She held it against her chest, and she sat there on that porch while the light went down and the stars came out over Birch Creek Road, and she didn't go inside until she was ready. Not until the cold made her. Not until the dark made her. Until she was ready, because Lenora Hollis had made a decision. And once Lenora Hollis made a decision, God help the man who thought he could unmake it. Harmon Leland came to the house on a Sunday. That detail matters. He didn't come on a Monday when a businessman might reasonably be making rounds. He didn't come on a Wednesday when the world is in the middle of itself and nobody pays attention to who's driving down which road. He came on a Sunday, the day Lenora went to church, the day she had gone to church every week for 52 years. He knew that. He knew she would be home by noon alone, still in her good clothes, still carrying the quiet that church gave her. He came at 12:30. He chose the hour the way a man chooses a weapon, carefully, with knowledge of what it would do. Lenora was in the kitchen when she heard the car pull into the driveway. Not a truck, not Grady Potts's mud-spattered Dodge. A black sedan with tinted windows and the kind of polish that doesn't happen by accident. She looked through the window above the sink and saw a man step out of the driver's side in a charcoal suit with no tie and shoes that had never touched dirt. Harmon Leland was in his mid-50s. He was not tall. He was not physically imposing. He had a lean build and close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that was pleasant without being memorable. The kind of face that was designed for boardrooms and handshakes and photographs at charity dinners where everyone smiles and nobody means it. His hands were smooth. His nails were clean. He looked like a man who had never fixed anything in his life and had never needed to because he could always pay someone else to fix it for him, or if that didn't work, to break it on his behalf. He walked up the porch steps without hurrying. He knocked twice. Polite, measured. The knock of a man who knows he will be answered because he has always been answered. Lenora opened the door, but before she did, she pressed one button on a flip phone sitting on the kitchen counter behind the bread box. Silas had given her the phone the week before. He had spent an afternoon showing her how to use it, how to make calls, how to check messages, and how to press one button, just one that would start the audio recorder. If he ever comes to you directly, Silas had told her, you press this button before you open the door. You don't tell him, you don't look at the phone, you just let it run. Lenora pressed the button the way a soldier chambers a round, without hesitation, without fanfare. Then she walked to the front door and opened it. Mrs. Hollis, he said. He smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced. The kind of smile that people who don't know better mistake for warmth. I apologize for showing up unannounced. I know this is your day of rest. I was hoping we might have a few minutes to talk. Lenora looked at him through the screen door. She didn't open it. She didn't invite him in. She stood on her side of the threshold the way a woman stands when she has decided exactly where her line is and how far she's willing to let someone cross it. I know who you are, Mr. Leland. Then you know I'm not here to cause you trouble. You've been causing me trouble for 3 years. You just haven't been doing it in person. The smile didn't waver. That was the thing about Harmon Leland that made him dangerous. He didn't react. He absorbed. He let other people's emotions hit him and fall to the ground without leaving a mark, and then he kept talking as if nothing had happened. It was a skill, the kind of skill that takes years to develop and a particular kind of coldness to maintain. I understand your frustration, he said. I do. And I want you to know that I've come here today because I believe we can resolve this in a way that benefits everyone. I have a new offer. It's significantly higher than anything that's been presented to you before. I think you'll find it more than fair. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He held it out toward the screen door. Lenora didn't take it. I've received 7 offers, Mr. Leland. Each one came with a different attorney and the same message. Sell or suffer. That's the offer. It's always been the offer. You just change the number on the front and pretend it's something new. Leland lowered the document. He looked at the porch. He looked at the ceiling above the porch where a section of wood had warped from water damage. He looked at the gutters, which were sagging on the left side. He looked at the garden, which had gone wild. He looked at everything the way a man looks at a property he already considers his. This is a beautiful piece of land, Mrs. Hollis. Your husband did a remarkable job with this house, but I'm sure you can see that maintaining it alone at your age is becoming— He paused, selecting the word the way a surgeon selects an instrument. Difficult. Every word was a blade, not swung, placed, inserted into the exact spot where it would do the most damage with the least visible effort. The warped porch ceiling, the sagging gutters, the overgrown garden, her age, her solitude. Everything that Lenora already knew and already felt and already fought against every morning when she woke up in a house that was too big for one person and too full of memories to leave. He was not threatening her. He was describing her life back to her in a voice that sounded like concern, and that was worse than any threat because it was the truth wrapped in something that looked like kindness and smelled like contempt. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said the thing that Harmon Leland was not expecting. Not because it was clever, not because it was loud, but because it came from a place in her that he had not calculated for. A place that 76 years of hard living and honest work and loving a good man had built in her like a foundation that goes deeper than the house it holds up. My husband built this house with his own 2 hands, she said. He came home from a war with a knee that never worked right and a heart that never stopped working, and he built this house over 2 summers because he believed that a man who builds something with his hands has made something that matters. He put his life into these walls, every room, every door frame, every board on this porch that you're standing on right now. She took one step closer to the screen door. You think I'm going to be afraid of a man in a suit who shows up on a Sunday to tell me my gutters need fixing, Mr. Leland? I have buried a husband. I have buried friends. I have sat in hospital rooms at 3 in the morning and held the hands of people who were dying. I know what fear looks like, and it doesn't look like you. Leland's smile was gone now, not replaced by anger, replaced by nothing. A blank. The default setting of a man who has just realized that the person in front of him is not performing strength for his benefit, but is operating from a kind of conviction that he does not have a playbook for. He stood on the porch for another moment, then he folded the document and put it back in his jacket pocket. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said. I genuinely am. But I want you to understand that the process that's been set in motion is not something I can stop. The bank has made its decision. The timeline is the timeline. And when this goes to court, Mrs. Hollis, it's going to go quickly, and the outcome is not going to be what you're hoping for. He turned to leave. He stopped at the top of the porch steps and looked back. I wish you'd reconsider. I really do. Because what comes next is going to be harder than anything you've been through so far. And you're going to go through it alone. He walked to his car. He got in. He drove away. The black sedan disappeared down Birch Creek Road and the dust settled and the house was quiet again. And on the kitchen counter behind the bread box, the flip phone had recorded every word. Because Lenora Hollis had spent 3 years being failed by every system that was supposed to protect her, and she had learned the lesson that those systems had been trying to teach her all along. Nobody is coming to save you, so you save yourself, you build your own weapon, you make your own evidence, and you wait for the moment when the man who thought you were powerless discovers that you are not. She picked up the phone. She pressed the button to stop the recording. She played it back once, listening to Leland's voice come through the tiny speaker, calm and polished and incriminating. She listened to herself steady and unbroken. She listened to the whole thing. Then she called Silas. He came, she said. Did you press the button? Before I opened the door. A pause on the other end. Then Silas said, good. It's all on there. Everything he said. Then he just gave you the only thing you needed. Lenora looked at the phone in her hand. A simple flip phone. A device so basic that she had laughed when Silas first showed it to her and said it couldn't even take pictures. But it could do one thing that mattered. It could listen. And now it was holding the voice of a man who had spent 3 years hiding behind attorneys and shell companies and silence, and who had walked onto her porch and said the quiet part out loud because he had looked at a 76-year-old woman and seen someone who couldn't possibly hurt him. He was wrong about that. He was wrong in the way that powerful men are often wrong about the people they underestimate. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack imagination. They cannot conceive of a world where the person they are stepping on has the ability to step back. They have never had to conceive of such a world because they have never lived in one. Lenora Hollis was about to introduce Harmon Leland to that world. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9 o'clock at the Allegheny County Courthouse. A stone building with columns that were meant to look like justice, and a parking lot that was too small, and a metal detector at the front door that beeped every time someone walked through it and was ignored by the security guard every time it beeped. Lenora arrived at 8:30. She was wearing a blue dress she had last worn to a church fundraiser 2 years ago. She had pressed it the night before. She had polished her shoes. She had put on the pearl earrings that Walter had given her on their 30th anniversary and that she only wore on occasions that mattered. In her left hand, she carried the spiral notebook. 12 pages, 3 colors of ink, a timeline of a conspiracy built on a kitchen table by a woman who had never been to law school and didn't need to because she had something more valuable than a law degree. She had the truth, and she had written it down. In her right hand, she carried the folded American flag in its triangle case. She set it on the plaintiff's table before she sat down. She didn't explain it. She didn't make a speech about it. She just set it there in front of her the way you set a photograph of someone you love on your desk, not for anyone else. For you, because you need it there, because it reminds you of who you are and whose you are and what you're fighting for. Corinne Voss sat beside her, a woman in her mid-40s with short auburn hair and reading glasses, and the particular energy of a person who has spent their entire career waiting for exactly this kind of case. She had reviewed Lenora's notes. She had reviewed Silas's research. She had pulled the Environmental Impact Amendment. She had traced the shell companies. And she had listened to the recording 3 times each time with a legal pad in front of her, marking the moments where Harmon Leland had crossed the line from persuasion to coercion. There were 7 such moments. Corinne had underlined each one. She had built a case the way an engineer builds a bridge, one support at a time, each one tested before the next one goes up until the whole structure is standing and the only thing left to do is drive across it. Silas sat 1 row behind Lenora. He was wearing a plain gray flannel shirt. No vest, no patch, no colors, no insignia. He looked like what he was, which was a man who had been stripped of the only identity he had left and had shown up anyway because some things are more important than what you're wearing. The courtroom filled slowly. Millbrook showed up, not for Lenora, not for Silas. They showed up the way people show up when they expect a spectacle and want to be able to say they were there when it happened. Harmon Leland was seated behind his attorneys. 2 of them, matching suits, the kind of suits that cost more than Lenora's car. They had matching briefcases and matching haircuts in the kind of coordinated confidence that comes from winning cases before they start because the outcome has already been arranged. The bank's representative sat beside them, a man with a thin face and a thinner smile and a folder full of documents and the expression of someone who has done this 100 times and expects to do it 100 more. The hearing began at 9. Leland's attorneys opened with a clean, efficient presentation. Mortgage default, missed payments, standard procedure. They cited statutes and precedents and dates and figures with the practiced fluency of men who have learned to make cruelty sound like paperwork. Nothing unusual, they said, nothing to contest, a straightforward matter of contractual obligation unfulfilled. Corinne Voss listened to all of it. She sat with her hands folded and her glasses on the tip of her nose, and she listened the way a woman listens when she has been waiting for her turn and knows exactly what she's going to do with it. When Leland's attorneys finished, the judge looked at Corinne, counsel for the respondent. Corinne stood up. She picked up a binder from the table, 3 inches thick. She walked it to the judge's bench and set it down with a sound that was louder than it should have been in a room that quiet. "Your Honor," she said, "what you've just heard is a description of a foreclosure. What I'm about to show you is a description of a crime." She opened the binder. Inside that binder was everything. The highway expansion route confirmed at the state level 8 months before Leland made his first offer to Lenora. The pre-announcement acquisitions strategy documented through a paper trail of shell company formations and dated within weeks of the route confirmation. The shell companies themselves, 7 of them each registered to a different address, but all sharing the same registered agent. The permit filings that had been expedited through the county office, the timeline that proved with the mechanical precision of a clock that Harmon Leland had known about the federal highway contract before he made his first offer to Lenora Hollis, and had used that knowledge to deliberately engineer her financial distress. And on page 212, the audio recording. Corinne pressed play. The courtroom heard Harmon Leland's voice, calm and polished and smooth, standing on a widow's porch on a Sunday afternoon, describing her failing house back to her like a diagnosis. They heard him tell her that what comes next would be harder than anything she'd been through. They heard him tell her she would go through it alone. They heard every word because Lenora Hollis had pressed one button on a flip phone and held the line. Leland's face changed. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in movies. It changed the way a wall changes when the first crack appears. Still standing, still intact. But the structural integrity is gone and everyone in the room can see it. And on the final page of the binder, a letter from the Federal Highway Administration confirming that the acquisition of Lenora Hollis's property would be subject to federal protections under the Veterans Heritage Land Preservation Act, a statute protecting the homesteads of decorated combat veterans and their surviving spouses from compelled displacement. Walter Hollis, Silver Star, 7th Infantry Regiment, the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, November 1950, the flag on the table, the citation on the mantle, the man who had carried 2 soldiers out of a fire because he couldn't leave them. All of it, every piece of it, leading to this room, this moment. This table where his widow sat in a blue dress with her hands folded and his flag in front of her, and the truth in a binder and the evidence on a recording and the law on her side because the country that her husband had bled for had written a statute that said, "You cannot take his home." Voss turned to the judge. Your Honor, the respondent would like to make a statement. The judge looked at Lenora. Mrs. Hollis, you may address the court. Lenora stood up. She did not tremble. She did not clutch the table or take a deep breath or do any of the things that people in courtrooms do when they are afraid. She stood up the way a woman stands up when she has been sitting for a very long time and has finally decided it's time. She looked at the judge. She looked at the room. She did not look at Harmon Leland. Your Honor, she said, my name is Lenora Hollis. I am 76 years old. I have lived in the same house on Birch Creek Road for 52 years. My husband Walter built that house with his own hands. Board by board, nail by nail. He fought in Korea. He came home with a silver star and a knee that never worked right, and he built us a life. He paid his taxes. He served his community. He never asked for anything he didn't earn. Neither have I. Her voice was steady, not rehearsed. Steady. The voice of a woman who has said these words to herself in her kitchen at midnight, and in her car on the way to a records office, and on her porch in the dark, and who is now saying them for the last time in the only room that has the power to make them matter. For 3 years I have tried to get help. I called the police. They didn't come. I asked my neighbors. They turned away. I wrote letters to my representatives. They didn't answer. I went to legal aid. I was told I made $11 too much to qualify. She paused. $11. She looked at the room. Every face, one at a time. The way a teacher looks at a classroom of children who have disappointed her and who she loves anyway. No one else would help me. The echo line, young, the same 4 words she had said through a rain-streaked window to a stranger on a motorcycle on a Tuesday night on Route 9. But different now. Different because of what came after. Different because of what she said next. Until a man that everyone in this town was afraid of got off his bike in the rain and fixed my car and sat across from me in a diner and listened. A man who had every reason to stay out of this and no reason to get involved except that he believed it was wrong. He lost his motorcycle. He lost his brotherhood. He lost his standing in the only family he had left. For me, a woman he didn't know. She paused. And then I decided something. I decided that if a man like that could give up everything he had for a stranger, then I could stand up for myself. I could walk into a records office and ask questions. I could write things down. I could press a button on a phone and let a man's own words be the evidence against him. I could come into this courtroom and tell you the truth. She looked at the flag on the table. She touched the edge of the case with one finger. This is Walter's flag. They gave it to me at his funeral. I've kept it on the mantle for 4 years. I brought it here today because I want this court to see what's at stake, not a piece of land, not a house, a life, a whole life that a good man built and that I promised I would protect. She sat down, she folded her hands, and she didn't say another word. The courtroom was still, the kind of stillness that isn't silence but something deeper. The kind that happens when a room full of people has just heard something they weren't prepared for and needs a moment to understand what it means. And then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head turned, every eye went to the doorway. Standing there filling the frame was Rex Brennan, full patch, full colors, leather vest with every insignia in place, the scar along his jaw catching the fluorescent light, his iron gray hair pulled back, his face carrying the expression of a man who has made a decision that cost him something and has come to deliver it in person. Behind him, 11 men, the entire Millbrook chapter, full patch, dress cuts, standing in the doorway of a county courthouse in formation, shoulder to shoulder, the way only men who have stood together for years know how to stand. They walked in without a word, boots on marble, leather and ink, and the particular gravity of men who take up space not because they want to be noticed, but because they cannot help it. They filled the back 2 rows of the courtroom and sat down and said nothing. Rex looked at Silas. Silas looked at Rex. And Rex said it loud enough for every person in that room to hear. We don't abandon our own. And anyone he stands for stands with us. He walked forward. He placed a second folder on the judge's bench. Inside it was documentation the club had pulled independently over the past 2 weeks. Bank communications obtained through a contact in the financial compliance office. Text messages. and a financial trail connecting Harmon Leland directly to fraudulent real estate transactions in 3 other Pennsylvania counties. Properties acquired through the same pattern, the same shell companies, the same strategy of targeting vulnerable landowners along projected development routes and engineering their financial distress. It wasn't just a land grab, it was a pattern, a system, and they had proved it. The judge looked at the binder, he looked at the folder, he looked at the recording transcript, he looked at the letter from the Federal Highway Administration. He looked at Harmon Leland, who was sitting very still behind his attorneys, with the particular expression of a man who has just realized that every exit in the room is closed. Leland was arrested before he stood up from his chair. 2 federal marshals who had been seated in the gallery since 8:30 that morning, placed there by the U.S. Attorney's Office, after a tip from Corinne Voss 3 days earlier, walked him out of the courtroom in handcuffs. His attorneys watched him go with the expression of men who are already calculating how to distance themselves from a client who has become a liability. The judge halted the foreclosure proceedings within the hour. The Federal Highway Administration was notified. A federal investigation was opened into Leland's operations across 4 counties. And under the Veterans Heritage Land Preservation Act, the property of Lenora Hollis on Birch Creek Road, the house that Walter Hollis built with his own hands over 2 summers in the early 70s, was placed under a protection order that would take an act of Congress to reverse. Lenora didn't shout, she didn't jump up, she didn't collapse or weep or do any of the things that people expect a person to do at the end of a long fight. She sat very still in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. The way people look when they're trying to hold something inside that is too big to hold and too important to let go of carelessly. Then she let out a breath, a single breath, the kind that has been held for a year or 3 years or 52 years, depending on how you count. And then she cried, not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, the way women cry when they have been strong for so long that they have forgotten what it feels like to stop. The tears came the way rain comes after a drought, slow at first, then steady, then the kind you don't try to stop because stopping them would be the same as denying that they matter. Silas reached forward from the row behind her and put his hand on her shoulder. Once, just once, the way a man puts his hand on something when he wants it to know he's there without asking it to carry his weight. Outside on the courthouse steps, the sun was out. The actual sun, for the first time in what felt like weeks. The sky was that particular shade of Pennsylvania blue that happens in late autumn when the air is clean and cold, and the light comes through the trees at an angle that makes everything look like it's being painted in real time. The club members had moved off to the side, standing in a loose group by their bikes, giving space the way men who understand space give it. Not leaving, just standing at the right distance. Present without intruding. Lenora found Silas standing alone at the bottom of the steps. He was looking at the trees across the street. Not at anything in particular, just at the light moving through the branches. She came and stood beside him. She was still holding the flag. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "Alan and I never had children," she said. She used Walter's middle name the way she sometimes did in private moments, the way a wife uses a name that belongs only to her. "We tried, it just wasn't in the cards. I made my peace with it a long time ago, or I thought I did." She paused. The light moved through the trees. "I've been alone in that house for 4 years, and I had started to think that was just what the rest of my life was going to be. Just me and the photographs and the flow and the sound of the third stair creaking. Just alone." She looked at him. Her eyes were clear, not sad, clear. The way eyes get when a person has cried everything out and what's left is just the truth, undecorated, undiluted, sitting right there on the surface. "But you came, and then they came." She gestured toward the club. "And I don't know how to thank a person for that. I don't know that there's a word big enough." Silas was quiet, and then Lenora said the thing that broke him open. Not in a loud way, not in the dramatic way that breaking open happens in stories. In the deep, permanent, quiet way that it happens in life. The way it happens when the truest thing you've needed to hear finally arrives not from where you expected it, not in the voice you expected, but at exactly the moment when you were ready to receive it. She looked at him and said, "You have a family now. And then because Lenora Hollis was not a woman who did things halfway, she reached up and put both arms around him and held on. She held on the way a mother holds on. The way a person holds on when they want you to understand that this is not a gesture or a formality or a social nicety. This is a claim. This is a declaration. You are mine now, and I am yours. And that is not going to change. Silas stood very still for a moment, the way a man stands when something hits him that he didn't know he was waiting for. And then he put his arms around her too. And they stood there on the courthouse steps in the November sunlight, a 76-year-old woman and a 51-year-old man holding on to each other the way people hold on when they have both been alone for a very long time and have finally found the thing that loneliness was pointing them toward all along. Rex returned Silas's patch at the clubhouse that Friday evening. No ceremony, no speeches. He just set it on the table in front of Silas and looked at him. You were right, Rex said. We were wrong to stay quiet as long as we did. That won't happen again. That was all. With men like Rex, that was everything. The chapter spent the following month helping Lenora with the house. They replaced the porch boards that had warped. They fixed the roof section that had been leaking since the fall. They repaired the kitchen ceiling. They rehung the gutters. They straightened the porch swing so it didn't lean anymore. They didn't make an event of it. They didn't post about it. They didn't call the newspaper. They just showed up on Saturdays and worked. Quietly, steadily, the way men work when they are not performing labor but paying a debt they didn't know they owed until someone showed them the bill. And Lenora made enough coffee to supply a small army, and she made sandwiches, and she asked every single one of them questions about their lives, their families, their work, their stories. And she remembered the answers, every name, every detail, because that was who Lenora Hollis was. A woman who believed that the least you can do for a person who shows up for you is to see them, really see them, to learn their name and remember it and use it and make them feel for even a moment that they are not invisible. Silas rode out to Birch Creek Road every few weeks after that. He never stayed long, an hour, sometimes two. He would check on the house, sit on the porch with a coffee. Let Lenora talk about Walter. She would talk about Walter and the house and the garden and the summers. And then she would ask about Liam, about Nathan, about the things Silas carried. And he would answer, not all at once, a little at a time. The way men like Silas answer, slowly, carefully, like they are deciding with each word whether it is safe to keep going, whether the person they are talking to can hold what they are about to say without dropping it. And it was. It was safe, because Lenora Hollis could hold anything. She had been holding things her whole life. Her husband's pain, her neighbor's grief, her own loneliness, the weight of a house and a life, and a memory and a flag in a triangle case. She had held all of it for decades without breaking. And now she could hold one more thing. She could hold Silas's story, and she did, gently, completely. The way you hold something that has been handed to you by someone who has never handed it to anyone before. The flag still sits on the mantle above the fireplace on Birch Creek Road. The citation beside it. The photographs of Walter on every wall. The third stair from the bottom still creaks because no one has fixed it, and no one will, because the sound of it is the sound of a man who once lived in this house and loved the woman who still does. And if you drive out to Birch Creek Road on a Saturday afternoon, you might see something. You might see an old woman on a porch swing that doesn't lean anymore because someone fixed it in October, drinking coffee and watching the light change through the trees her husband planted. And you might see a motorcycle parked in the driveway. And you might hear, if you listen carefully, the sound of two people talking on a porch about the people they have lost and the people they have found, and the strange, stubborn, unbreakable thread that connects the two. Reputation isn't character. A patch isn't a person. And brotherhood, real brotherhood, isn't blind loyalty to whoever happens to be standing beside you. It is the willingness to stand up when it costs you something, when it costs you everything. And to do it anyway, because the alternative is becoming someone you can't live with. And family isn't blood. Family isn't paperwork. Family isn't the people you were born next to. Family is the people who show up. Family is the people who stay. Family is a man who gets off his bike in the rain for a stranger, and a woman who opens her door to a world she was taught to be afraid of and finds on the other side of that fear the one thing she had been missing for 4 years. Someone to sit on the porch with. Someone to remember the names. Lenora Hollis is sitting on that porch right now, in the house her husband built with his own hands, watching the light move through the trees he planted, the flag on the mantle, the coffee in her hands, the notebook in the drawer closed now its purpose served. And beside her, in a chair that Walter used to sit in, a man with tattooed arms and a warm expression, in a patch he almost lost, in a story he is learning one word at a time to tell. She is not alone anymore, and neither is he.